All right. Welcome everyone to the third meeting of SIG WebDev of the semester. I have now uploaded um, the source code, the current up-to-date source code on the ACM GitHub. I'll post this link of the description of the uploaded video once we are finished recording. That'll be available. But if you do not have the code that we've built up so far, you will want to get that downloaded and get that running. It's fairly simple, and you'll be able to see exactly how we wrote that and how we got to this point in the previous videos. So we will be expanding upon this. Today we're going to be touching on more advanced JavaScript, bootstrap, and responsive design. We're going to be touching a little bit on it. So we're going to be doing a bit of an extended dive on what we've touched on so far, and then expand on that even further. So JavaScript continued. Before I get into this, does anybody have any questions up until now? I know you guys just got here. Feel free to download the source code and go back and watch the videos up until this point. So after we're done here, it's all available on the YouTube channel. Once I post, you'll see that I'll post this video afterwards. And you'll be able to see all the videos we made up until now. We're doing a series of 5 tutorials, and then we're going to start on a larger project. So we're building a foundation for everybody, just in case, because there's a lot of people who are completely new to web design. So, awesome. Who's in the Discord right now? I know we've got 2 people in here. Okay, so we got 2 people in.
So I'm not exactly in the Discord, are you? Because I'm not here to
Yeah, we can get you added just after the meeting.
Sure.
I'll get you on the Discord, or you can have somebody else invite. Say again? We're using Visual Studio Code. Yeah. I think in the first video I show how to set up Visual Studio Code and get the extensions installed. Most everything is set up for you by default for web development. So last time what we had was our fancy site button, which asks for our name. And then we took that name and we added it to our list here. So let's learn a little bit more about JavaScript. So objects and arrays. So up until now we've been defining variables as just, var whatever equals whatever. And it's usually like an integer or a string. You could do floats. But since JavaScript is dynamically typed, there's no, you could set it to anything. But with objects and arrays, arrays are basically the same. You do var, whatever the name is, equals, and then you would use the brackets. And these brackets would allow you to define an array, and you can fill that with something. You could, and all the arrays are dynamic unless you set it to const. So if you do like const array equals then array, then you won't be able to edit it. But if you do not give it something at the beginning, you can always add stuff later. It's completely immutable, or it's completely mutable at the beginning. So you don't have to worry about, like, if you program like C++ or something, where you can't change the size of an array. Arrays in JavaScript are very similar to Python. They're dynamic. You don't have to worry about that. The next thing is very similar, is an object. Now, an object is a way to define uh, a variable with different parts. So, for example, we have a car here. Our car has a name, it's a Fiat, a model, 500, a weight, 850 kilograms, color, white, and then it also has a function an, uh, as part of the object. Now that probably reminds you of a class. And whilst, yes, technically, JavaScript does have a separate class structure, which we'll get to at some point in the future. The basic object is more similar to a struct, for example, if you've ever programmed C++. So, again, here's how you would define an array. Now I'm using const right here, so it's not modifiable, but if you wanted to make it modifiable, you just do var. We have an array of Fiat and Ford, and if we want to access the first element of the array, we would just call it with car array, and then in brackets the index. It's 0 index, so 0 will be the first element in the list. And so I want to mention really quickly something about scope. I went over it a little bit in the previous videos, talked a little bit about how scope, how there's different things like var, let, and const. We've seen them all, but we haven't actually, I haven't really explained what the difference is. So JavaScript has 3 different ways of looking at a variable in terms of scope. You have your global, which is a global variable. Most of you have heard of global variable. You have blocks. You have your global variables, and then whenever you're looking at a function, a variable inside of a block. Now, a block is anything that is in between curly braces. So, if you're defining an object and it has curly braces, just assume if it has curly braces, any variable defined inside of those curly braces will not be accessible outside of those curly braces. And that is what's called a block. Now functions are very similar when you're dealing with variables. Any variable defined inside of a function will only be accessible inside the function. So there is one thing that one example that I want to show you is that if you're defining a var and a let, here's the most important thing to think about. If you're using var and you define a global variable, a var or const, that variable will be accessible from anywhere. You can use the window function. Every sort of website has a window object, and inside that window object will have your global variables. Now, if you use let, which is another way to define variables, which is basically the same as var, let is more strict. If you define a global variable with let, it will not be accessible outside. It will not be accessible from the window object. That is one important distinction. I'll use var for most things. You may see me throw in let here and there, but as far as we're concerned for right now, they do the exact same thing. Now, next thing, when we're dealing with arrays and objects, a lot of the time we'll be dealing with objects, arrays of objects. So it's important for us to be able to effectively run through objects and manage them. So this is what we have as higher order functions. This is a function of a function of a function of a function I mean, you could keep going. You have functions of functions of functions. So a higher order function is a function that receives a function as an argument. So we had learned about different types of functions and how we define them. Today we're going to be learning about arrow functions. We may have touched them a little bit before, but arrow functions allow you to take, for example, filter. So you would have an array that you defined. So our array of cars here, const char array. So if we do char array dot filter, and then inside of the parentheses, we're going to define a arrow function, which the first part of the arrow function is the element that is passed in. So it's going to run through each of these elements one by one, is the element that we passed in. And then we need to say, okay, we're going to filter out things. So if we return true, then that means that our new array, which will be returned by this, will have that element. If we return false, then it will not have that element. Map, similarly, it goes through every element, makes another array, copies the array, but this time it's going to modify every element with the code that we send in. And then for each is the most important one that you'll see a lot. You've probably seen it in like C++. They have that as part of the newer standard. For each allows you to quickly go through every element of an array and do something, run some code. So let's open up our code editor and let's look at this and see how these work in action. So we are going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and comment all of this out from our previous. And we're going to change this onClick here to add names or add elements. We're going to create a function here. Add elements. So we're going to define an array here of names. We'll just put down random names. There, we'll have 4 names. Now, if we go and, for right now, we can just do a simple console.log our names array whenever we click the button. And we're going to open our JavaScript console here. Go to developer tools. So if we click this button, you'll see it prints out the array here. We have 4 elements. And one thing I want to point out is that there are some, there's more in here than just the 4 names. There's a little, we have our array indexes here, but then we have another thing here, length. So everything, pretty much everything in JavaScript is an object, and it's there's a lot of parts that are inherited. So one of the things is that every array has a length. So we can go in here and log the length. And this is an easy way to see like other attributes of your site. So if I click on this, you'll see we get 4 if we change that to length. The other thing is that there is a prototype. So I won't go too deep into prototypes right now, but an array is a prototype where the prototype of the array defines all of the functions that can be run on that array. So we just saw filter, map, for each, they're all in here. Join, shift, slice. So all of these functions right here are basically defined as part of the object of what can be done to this object. So now we see how we define arrays. Let's go ahead and let's do names array dot for each. And now we have an element coming in. We'll have a name coming in. And then we'll run a function whenever that happens. Now, we can do this several different ways, as we saw before. This is just a shorthand way of writing a function. We saw other ways of doing function. We could do function, name, do it this way. That also works. But the way that it is done commonly, especially when you're writing them inline like this, is that you would just use an arrow function. And we will log out the name. So whenever we get this, we'll go through and log every name that's in the array. So what we can do with this, now that we have that, is we can append. Go ahead and look up here. And we'll go ahead and grab some of the code that we used previously. Let's go ahead. This is going to be unique to each one. So you see right here, we query selector for the UL. As we saw before, it grabbed the unordered list that we have here. And then it's going to create a new name list item with this list item here. It's going to set the text content to the name, which is going to be coming from each element that comes in. And then we're going to set the ID, which isn't super important. That's just something we did before, but it is good to set the ID of these to make sure that you can always reference them and modify how they look later. And then we append them to the main unordered list. So if we click right here, you'll see that it adds all of our array elements here. Runs through, creates elements, appends them to the list. Very, very simple, very, very powerful. Because as you'll see once we get into looking at APIs, you'll grab a bunch of data and then you'll just want to spit it out to the screen a lot of the times. You'll grab a bunch of database users and you want to put them all on the screen. As you can see, our website is extremely secure because why would anybody hack the website when we just display all of our users' information on the front page? So, yeah. Let's go ahead and get back here. Awesome. So next thing I want to cover is promises. So a promise in JavaScript is a way to handle asynchronous data. So whenever you go out and you go to grab some data from an API, that API is not going to respond instantly. Sometimes it could be a matter of nanoseconds. Sometimes it can be a matter of minutes, depending on the site that you're trying to access. So what a promise does, it basically says, okay, I'm going to call this function now, and I'm going to have something that I need to do whenever I get that data back. But for right now, we're just going to keep going, and then once we get that data back, we'll handle it. So this is important, obviously, for APIs. It's important for many different things. If you're trying to access a database, if you're trying to like wait for a certain thing, you have a timer or something on the site, and you want to wait for that timer to go down, and then you want to do something. That is a way to do it. Probably not the best way to do it, but it is a way you could do it. So anything that returns a promise, you will do a .then, and then you'll have a function, an arrow function like we just did, and it's always recommended to have a .catch. A .catch is just there if an error happens. Then you'll catch it and you'll deal with it. In both of these, .then, it'll pass some sort of argument into the object, and then a .catch will, the error will be passed in as the argument, and we'll handle that. Now, you can chain your promises, so you have like a .then, and then you'll have like multiple .catches sometimes. It can be pretty complicated. There are better ways nowadays to deal with this, but for right now, for the sake of simplicity, we'll be just looking at promises, the sort of older way, and then eventually we'll look at async and await and look at how they, how you would handle those. So, APIs. This is what we've been building up to so far, getting a basic website, and then we're building up to getting an API, getting some data from the outside to display on our site. Because even if it's not from the outside, like getting it from the greater internet, you know, your front end is going to grab data from your back end, and it's going to communicate over an API. So this, for front end developers, is where the sort of line where the front end and the back end sort of separates. This is where we start. Once the front end developers, they'll need to know how to do APIs, but then the actual API will be handled by back end developers. So it's important to understand that all web requests are made up of, they'll have a specific header that tells it what you're trying to accomplish. For example, here we have get, put, delete, and post. Now they're pretty obvious what they do. Delete something. Get something. Post and put, not as obvious, but put means update, and post means create something. Now these are only like sort of recommendations. You could only return data. You can make a post request and only return data and not handle any of the data sent in. You can, same with a put. Somebody could do a put and you could only return data. Not a good way to handle things, but that is, you're not technically restricted. All it is technically a line in the packet that's being sent that says, hey, this is a put request, this is a get request. Whenever you type in https://www.google.com, that is by default a get request. It assumes that every request you're making is a get request. Now, whenever you go and submit a form on some sort of website, that's going to be a post request because you're sending data, creating some data on the remote server. So you're going to send a post request. We'll be looking at get requests right now, and maybe we'll look at a post request. Not sure how we are on time. And the last thing before we actually get to writing some API code, JSON. JSON is important to learn. It's not a language. Doesn't have really anything to do with programming in the sense of like coding and stuff like that, but it is how data is formatted. It defines how the data is going to be transferred. There are several different ways you could do this. In the old days, before the days of REST APIs, when we were still working with, I forget what they're called, the old way of handling APIs. I'm trying to think of what they're called. But back in the old days, it was just sort of like, okay, I hope we agree on it. I assume the front end and the back end agree on what we're communicating. It could be a long string of random ass text that doesn't mean anything. You just got to hope that whoever's on the front and whoever's on the back, well, they agree on a common way of talking. There have been some like standards, but they're more or less standards defined by, oh, I'm the biggest company who makes the programs that creates these APIs, so I define the standard because I'm big. But JSON is the modern way of interpreting data. As you can see, it looks similar to JavaScript objects in the sense that you have a key value pair for all of these variables. And then One thing that's different though is that you'll notice it's kind of hard to see from that far away, but you notice that this is a square bracket and this is a curly brace. This is a square bracket. I know those are curly brace. That is a square bracket. If it's a square bracket, that means that it's an array of elements. So we'll see right here we have orders. If this was an array of orders, you could just keep writing more orders. You just do a comma after this, and you would just write another order. But anything with curly braces is going to be actual like data. So we have an order number here. We can have any number of customers. So yeah, it's important to see that anything with a square bracket is going to be a list of something. It can be 1, it can be 0, it can be a million. And anything with a curly brace is going to be a set of definitions, key value pairs. The keys are pretty much always strings. The values can be numbers. You'll see in this one that they're all separated. They all are surrounded by quotes, but the actual standard doesn't say that everything has to be a string. So a lot of the times you will see that it is actually sent over as a number and interpreted as a number. But whenever your program, a lot of times the automated converting to JSON, which we'll look at in a minute, will turn any numbers into strings, just because it's easier to handle it that way. So yeah, this is the language of APIs, of modern APIs. So let's look at making our first request. So we're going to be using fetch. Fetch is very simple. It fetches something. It's actually not a good way to put it, because you can make post requests, which doesn't fetch, it posts. So fetch is the sort of basic Java way. There is we'll look at there's other ones that also do the same things as fetch, but fetch is a really easy one. It's included in pretty much all modern JavaScript APIs, so it's an easy one and can be defined very simply. Fetch returns a promise and is by default get. You'll see right here we have fetch, we have the link to the site, and we'll be using this API as well. It's a good test API. And then we'll have an object, a JavaScript object that's defined here. You can define it separately, or you can just define the object in line, which is pretty common. Again, another object here. It's inside of here. And yeah, so this example we're using method post, headers. This is specifically for post requests, but we'll get into that in a minute. And then we'll see we have a .then with a function here. It returns a res.json, which converts the variable passed in, which is the response from the request, and we convert it to JSON. And then, see what I did there? And then it goes and it logs that data out, the data that is passed in, because res.json also returns a promise. Why it does, I don't know. That's a great question. But res.json does return a promise, so you have to deal with it like a promise. You have to do .then, and then you have your raw data. And we can look at the object and how it's built all along the way. And I'll show you how it works. And of course, we have a catch down here. So it catches all the errors, and we just log out error. So, yeah.
Sorry, that .then, that last .then, what does it return?
The last .then doesn't return anything.
Okay, so .catch can operate on what exactly?
.catch returns on any time that there is a .then, so you're handling a promise, you're going to need to have a .catch. And .catch will catch any errors along that line of promises.
Okay.
And then it'll pass. So if there's an error here, it would just go, okay, I errored out, send the error into .catch and handle it. If there was an error here, it'll go, okay, stop here, go to the error and send it in, print out error.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's an error here, again, it would also go all the way down the chain and then go to the catch and print out the error. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, let's look at some code. We aren't going to be hopping directly into code this time. We are going to be looking at Postman. If you've ever used Postman, it's great for testing APIs. And we can look at what the API is going to return before we actually write code to handle that API. Let's go ahead and go to Postman. Postman.com. And you'll want to install this in your free time. What? All right. All right, now let's create a new workspace here. HTTP request. Now we're going to send a request to the site that was in the example. .io/API/users. Is that site not up anymore? I hope it is. Oh, it's on recres.in now. Guess they got off the IO bandwagon. All right, so this is just a sample that returns some users. And as you can see here, we have data, we have ID of a user, an email, a first name, a last name, an avatar. It's just a sample image. And you have some pages. For example, you got total pages 2, and just some different information about the API. So yeah, we can see the results that we're getting here. So we should expect to get those results on our website, and we want to handle that. So let's go ahead and write a fetch request. We're going to fetch our request is going to be to this https://recres.in/API/users. We are not going to have any options because we just want to get whatever's in there, so we don't actually need any options here. We'll do .then to handle the, and usually whenever you're doing these, you just do .then, a new line, and then the response would be sent in here, and we can console.log the response. Awesome. Now if I click here, you'll see that we got our response here. Let me make it bigger. We'll see we have our response here. We got an OK, redirected as false. The status text is OK. Our URL. But you'll notice that the actual data isn't there. It's technically here. but it's not readable. It's technically comes in as a readable stream, which needs to be converted. Now this does have like a automatic, whenever you convert it to JSON, it'll automatically assume you're looking for the body's content to be converted into JSON. So that's where that .then comes in, that other .then. So we're going to do res.json, which is going to return another promise. .then. Now, if we console.log the JSON, you'll see we got the exact same return. So we got your data here, we got our objects, which are a bunch of our users, avatar, email, first name, ID, last name. So yeah, we called an API, we got some data. Now let's do something with that. Now, normally when you would take this, we'll go ahead and do then, and we'll receive a JSON object. Let's go ahead and put this in curly braces, and we're just going to steal our little section up here again. We're just going to create items for these users. Be more specific. So we're going to, as you can see here, we have data. Data is an array of 6 elements. So we want to look at data. So JSON.data.forEach. Now we're going to steal this. Do.
I'm not sure if it's on my end, but I'm looking at the stream and it's like really choppy.
Yeah, and sometimes I've noticed that it's been doing that, but usually in the recording it shows up fine. Last time it happened, it went back to normal pretty quickly.
I mean, it's been consistently like a second per, or a frame per 5 seconds.
Yeah, just let me know if anybody else is having that issue. Okay, so now if we're looking at the JSON.data.forEach, we want to grab, this will return this object, each of these objects. So we want to grab the name, we'll do the first name. So actually we can rename this to like user object. So we want to grab the user object dot first name. So now, if we click that, we now have data from an API being used on our website. Crazy. So we grabbed data, we fetched it, and then we slapped it on the front of our page. Very fancy, I know. Really doing some great stuff here. But we are using REST APIs, which is important. So you're using a modern API to grab data and display it on a web page. Awesome. Very practiced. Now, really quickly, before we end, My laptop is crying right now because it's dying. Really quickly, making things look pretty for non-UI UX designers. If you're a UI UX designer, love to have you. That's awesome. But we programmers are lazy. We want things to work. We want them to look nice without having to put a whole lot of effort into making them look fancy. So we're going to be using Bootstrap. Bootstrap is awesome. Bootstrap is nice because it allows you to just bootstrap whatever you want onto the page and make it look nice. So we just include the link from Bootstrap. I believe it's Get Bootstrap is the website, getbootstrap.com. Now, the documentation for Bootstrap is fantastic. Some of the best documentation you'll see. Has plenty of examples, has some awesome stuff in there. There's a quick start in here. We're just going to go ahead and copy this quick start in here. And then we're going to go into our HTML. And above all of our style sheets, we're going to add this link here. So now if we save that, shouldn't get any errors or anything. Awesome. You'll already notice that our site has sort of changed a bit because some default styling that Bootstrap does. So we're going to look at how we would customize a button because that's something we have on our site. Content. Yeah, maybe it's component. Yeah, buttons. There we go. Buttons. So you see all these fancy buttons? These look awesome. They give you the exact code you need to write right here. So if we go into our button that we have here, let's go ahead and type equals button. I don't think that's required, but you know, who might argue with the documentation? Class equals button, and then we'll do a blue one, we'll do a green one. So class is button, and that's like the default styling. Every button will have like a default style, and then we need to tell it what kind of button it is. So right here, it's a button button success, btn dash success for green. Now if we save that, our fancy site button is now even fancier. I mean, I thought it was the fanciest thing that late 2000s could offer before, but now it's the fanciest thing that the early 2010s could offer. And it even adds stuff to the site. How cool is that? Probably not that cool, but you'll be able to take all of these things that we've put together so far, and you can build crazy things. Like they have, just look at the examples. They have example sites here. All of this styling is done by Bootstrap. I think the Bootstrap site is made with Bootstrap. So I'm sure normally in like super complicated and big websites, they will have some of their own like styling just to make things like work. But for the most part, everything will be done for you. So yeah, here's the image I stole for our presentation, if you remember. So yeah, great stuff. Great work they're doing there. Once we get into Vue, React, and Angular, like Vue has its own Bootstrap specifically for Vue, and it's super nice because of the way that Vue handles their objects and everything. Their HTML elements, you can add them very nicely. And then Angular, you literally add it the same way. It's just in the main, and then you just add it like classes like this. I love it with Angular. I don't like it so much with Vue because it's like a re-overhaul of Vue to add Bootstrap. So some of the features are not implemented from the main Bootstrap line, but Angular does because it's just adding it like this. And then we'll get into React and stuff. It has its own like styling from Facebook. So yeah, read the documentation. Oh yeah, and automatic responsive styling. We won't really have time to get into responsive design at the, but next time we will look at responsive design. Bootstrap handles all of the pain of responsive design for you. So even if you're not using the colorizing and making everything look fancy, just having Bootstrap handle the containers for you is great because it'll handle all of the Flexbox is super annoying to learn and really annoying to deal with because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And CSS grid, I mean, you shouldn't be using grids, but people still build their websites off CSS grid. So Bootstrap just handles all of the hard stuff for you. It's built off of Flexbox and some other fancy APIs. We'll be using Bootstrap 4 for most of it, just because all of the APIs that are in Bootstrap 4 are supported by modern browsers, by most modern browsers. There is a Bootstrap 5, but we won't be looking at that for right now. All the cool stuff is in Bootstrap 4, so we already did the practice. Awesome. Next topics. HTML forms. I kept saying we're going to get to that. I thought we were going to get to it today, but no. Advanced CSS styling. We'll look at some more CSS styling. Main thing I want to look at is like Sass and SCSS. It's just an easier way to write CSS. Responsive design, we'll be looking at media queries and CSS. That's part of the more advanced CSS. And seeing how Bootstrap works underlying. It's important to know this because Bootstrap, there may be some extra styling that you want to do for your site for mobile users that you just won't be able to get Bootstrap to do by default. So you'll have to overwrite it and then just handle a media query slightly differently if you're going to be like change how it looks change it in a different way on the mobile version or like a tablet version. And then again, frameworks and libraries, frameworks versus libraries, Angular, Vue, and React. Those are our next two meetings. If you aren't, go ahead and you'll want to make sure that you're caught up for the next one because we'll be going straight back to HTML. We'll be working mostly in HTML and CSS. Thank God we're done with JavaScript for now. But rest while you can because by the time, whenever we get to Angular, Vue, React, they are super heavy on the JavaScript. So, yep. Thank you all for coming. Does anybody have any questions before my battery dies? You have approximately 4% left.
What have you done specifically with web development? Do you have like any projects you're working on the side right now, or?
My personal website is, I developed my personal website, christianbigman.com. It's okay. I haven't updated it in a really long time. That one's in Angular. I also do have a Vue version of that site. I work for the university, and I built some sample sites that they wanted to show for testing, for managing SSH user keys and stuff. That's all on my GitHub. That was done in Vue. So yeah, quite a chunk of web development, but
Okay. And you said you work for the university?
yeah,
You're a student, you're working
yes,
senior or?
I'm a junior. All right. Well, if there's no more questions related to web design, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording, and send any messages in the comments of the video if you're watching this later, or just send me a ping on Discord. Thank you all for coming.